San Francisco, Santa Barbara, of course. Excellent. Well, hey, here's how this is going to flow. We have about an hour together, and I know you all have been probably bouncing between rooms like this, between main sessions and workshops. We really do want this to be more of an interactive workshop space. There will definitely be content we're going through, but seeking to integrate interaction with each other. We won't be going into breakout groups, into small groups. We'll be staying here on this page together, which I think is possible with about 25 folks. And we're all learned now in our Zoom skills over the last year of COVID. So I'll trust that we can pull that off together. My name is Jon Huckins. I'm the co-founding director of Global Immersion. We're a peacemaking training organization. Our work is to train people of faith to engage our very divided, conflicted world in restorative ways. Our hope and our trust is that God is restoring all things, and that our invitation is to be part of it, to be peacemakers who are joining God and healing what's broken in us, in our homes, on our streets, and in our world. And we over this next hour, we're going to talk very practically about what that could look like, because peace can oftentimes get stuck in a 30,000 foot idealistic framework, and we're going to work hard to make this as practical for each one of you in your own context as we can. For us as an organization, the last year has shifted really significantly, as you would imagine. In fact, I'm in my office right now reflecting that it was 1 year ago this weekend, actually, that we hosted what we call an immersion trip. And it was our last immersion trip we've hosted because of COVID. And the primary way we've trained in the work of peacemaking is to actually take people like yourselves into the center of global conflicts to learn from the peacemakers embedded within. Because we found that there's no better people to teach peace than those that are actually practicing it in the midst of conflict. So over the last decade, we've been guiding delegations into the center of conflict between Palestine and Israel, and all of our colleagues that are working for peace in that area, Jews, Christians, and Muslims. And then also here in the borderlands of Tijuana, San Diego, which is where I live. I'm about 10 minutes from the border from where I stand right now. And that has been a dynamic classroom to train people to actually see in 3D this good news, this gospel of God's restorative work, and how we participate in it, and folks that allow us to be invited into the ways that they're waging peace in their own context. Over this we were also doing online trainings before this last year, but now in this last year, it's largely been moments like these. And so we'll anticipate that we can integrate some of the stories and learnings from international contexts and also from our own streets and neighborhoods, and move them towards our call to follow Jesus in our own space. So I really want you to be thinking about your own context right out of the gate. All the content that's going to come at you, it's only helpful in so much as you're integrating it and allowing it to inform your own relationships, your own leadership, your own neighborhood, the dynamics around your table. And so you may have seen, even in my in our online event page, I had asked a couple questions, and they were along the lines of, what conflict is real to you right now? What are you bringing into this workshop that's manifesting itself in ways that's stirring anxiety, frustration? Maybe it's anger. Maybe it's a sense of isolation and withdrawal. Maybe it's fear. I think we all have these in different ways, whether it's out of the political circles that we have all felt so tangibly, especially in the last year, whether it's theological stuff in the church, whether it's interpersonal stuff with your family, with your friends. We all carry some level of dissonance probably into this room around conflict. And I want you to be thinking through that. And we're going to have an opportunity to share some of that out here in a bit. So my goal here is to create space to offer a theology. How do we think about peace and peacemaking from a theological perspective? Offer 4 core practices, and all throughout be working this stuff out together. How does this apply? How does this inform our own context? Because the reality is we live in a culture of fear and divide and polarizing rhetoric, and many of us are falling victim either to joining the frenzy and just trying to continue to win, rather than to get curious, to understand. We're trying to have our bullet points in line and win every argument, or to destroy. Or some of us are feeling that tension and we're just withdrawing from it. We're isolating from it, largely because we don't have tools to engage the conflict well. And we think there's a better way. We think there's a way to actually move towards the conflict with tools to heal and to transform, not to withdraw, nor to engage it as a way to perpetuate the conflict. The reality is we follow an others-oriented, enemy-loving God, and we are invited to do the same. I'm going to share a PowerPoint here with you all. And my hope for this is that it would be helpful, not a distraction. So don't feel like you need to be overly connected to this. And I'll probably stop sharing screen from time to time because it doesn't allow me to see you as much as I would like, which is not my favorite thing. I can now only see a handful of you. But what the reality is, as we think about the moment we're in, and we carry that potential dissonance around the table of this workshop, we have to ask the question, why do we even take this seriously? Why do we have a conversation about peacemaking? Is it worth it? Can it actually inform the way that I live and love and lead in my own context? Where do I find hope? And this has been so disintegrated from what it means to follow Jesus, especially for those of us in Western Christianity, that we have to look back on our tradition to understand that we actually have a storied history as followers of Jesus of living as peacemakers. The first 300 years of the church post-Jesus, from Jesus to Constantine, it was normative for Christians to understand discipleship and peacemaking as synonymous. There's a great study that came out by Dr. Ron Sider a few years ago that talked about Christians and nonviolence. And he chronicled those 300 years. And what he found was, with the exception of a couple questionable events, Christians at every moment in those 300 years chose an ethic of nonviolence. They had a commitment to peacemaking, even if it cost them their own lives. Because for them, that's what they saw in Jesus, a peacemaker who was willing to wage peace to the point of a cross to bring about resurrection and healing. And so we have tools within our Christian story that we can excavate and begin to learn from, and even give us hope to go into these kinds of conversations with an anticipation that we can be equipped with tools to heal rather than to win or to destroy. So let me ask this question. Actually, before I ask this question, I'll just share a picture of my family, because they are central to how I interact with all of this stuff. And I think it's important to note that, again, peacemaking isn't a 30,000-foot idea. It's our own homes. I just left my house to come here on a Saturday from these four faces, Ruby, Rosie, Hank, and Lou, 10 to 5. The youngest two are twins at 5. And my wife, Jan, is incredible. And we seek to live, like, they know that Daddy's job is to teach peacemaking. They know that when I left an hour ago from the house, I was going to teach peacemaking. And they also see that as central to who we are as a family. When we're driving to school in the mornings, which is not happening right now, we're talking about what's it going to mean to be a peacemaker at school today. And when I pick them up, we're reflecting, what did that look like for you at school today with your friends, and having people that might feel left out, or sharing our stuff. And we're constantly working this stuff into our everyday life. We often like to think of it as every day is an opportunity to go to the gym, to build these muscles of peacemaking, because our culture hasn't given us the tools to build those well. In fact, our culture would be antithetical in so many ways to actually living as peacemakers. And so this is my little crew. We live in a neighborhood with our church community called Sherman Heights, and we're just outside downtown San Diego. Most of our neighbors are immigrants, and a high population of them are undocumented. Our proximity to the border is a major factor in that. We really see this neighborhood and the wider borderlands as our context of practice. And so, many of my kiddos here have friends whose parents have been deported in the last couple of years. And what does it mean for us to have that conversation around our table? Many of my kids are all the time. My kids are asking about our friends and neighbors who live on the streets, and how do we interact in ways that are actually acknowledging the humanity, the dignity, and the image of God in so many of these folks. And so we're trying to work this stuff out in our own space, in our own church community, as we live as a community committed to this place. How do we not run from each other when we disagree on something, whether it's theology or how we raise our kids? How do we move through that as an opportunity for our collective growth? So that's a little bit about my context in my family. I want to ask the question, as you're coming around this virtual table today, and maybe we hear from a few of you, what is, what's a conflict you're bringing to this space today? And you don't have to get specific. Hey, I'm really wrestling through this thing with my mom or whatever it might be. But describe some of the characteristics of some of those lingering conflicts, that dissonance that you're feeling even as we go into this conversation today. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen for a minute so I can see your faces. And then go ahead and just unmute yourself and share just in a few sentences what's some characteristics of what you're feeling in regards to conflict in this moment. Darren.
Yeah, just as I wrote, it's natural for me to avoid conflict.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm probably like a lot of people, I just would prefer to be happy all the time, right? And so I pretty much turned my back on conflict.
Mm-hmm.
Came to this session thinking maybe you could give me some insight into ways that I could, if I'm afraid, or what is it that drives me that way.
Excellent.
My dad used to call me Pollyanna, which is a...
Mm-hmm. Yep, I'm with you.
And then other people say, oh, your attitude's so great and all that, but it's great when everything's going good.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing that and for your transparency.
Yeah, you're
Appreciate
welcome.
it. Who else wants to jump in?
Well, I'm Karen. I just want to say I feel lost of some great community over the years. Mm-hmm. It's not like we're fighting and yelling, but I just feel a loss of some very long time relationships and community. And I know the pandemic's part of that, but a lot of it is division over politics as well.
Yeah, that's right. Thank you. Who else wants to jump in?
I think for me, and Priscilla, I think a tough thing right now is in the community that I'm in, especially like the church community, there's some very different conceptions of how to deal with race issues and conversations about race. And I'm just struggling to know how to engage with people in a way that allows them to keep engaging and me to keep engaging without us separating ourselves from each other.
Yeah. Thank you. I've already heard race, I've heard politics, I've heard interpersonal conflict, I've heard personal formation. Pat, go ahead. You're on mute, Pat, at the moment. There we go.
Okay, I have a family member that only cares about money and not about God, and I just avoid at all costs.
Yep.
Because I don't care about money, and I care about God. I let her know I love her, but I avoid her.
Mm-hmm. Thanks for sharing that. That's it. And that's sorry, real quick. That's one of the things that I think is so precarious, is when we don't even have a common baseline for relationship and for these conversations. It makes it really challenging to even get in the room to be able to have these constructive movements through conflict. Yes, go ahead. Sorry, Mandy.
That's okay. I think one of my questions is how much energy to put into certain relationships that have been lost lately because of different ideas of living out Jesus's word, with dear longtime friends, and my church is going through some of those changes, and it's a lot to try and figure out. Do you just keep trying to give your energy to the people that you're leading and who you do have hope to lead in a certain direction, or how much do you put into restoring and keeping up with places where there's real brokenness and difference now where there wasn't before.
Yeah. Thanks, Mandy. And I think that reiterates the importance of discernment, even in all this. We're all limited in our time and energy and resource, and it takes a toll. And so discernment is really critical.
Yeah, thanks.
Anyone else want to share?
Hi, my name is Matt, and the conflict that I usually find myself in these days is, so I'm from Hong Kong, and I don't know if you've been following the international events there of the past year and a half, but for those who don't know, the government has been cracking down alongside the Central People's Government in China of any kind of pro-democracy activism and pro-human rights activism. And so for a young person and a dual citizen like myself, that puts a really big target on my back.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's right. Thanks for bringing that up. Appreciate it. And that's, I think, the socio-political reality is what you're inviting us into as well. This happens. Conflict is not just a personal thing; it's also a systemic. And we would talk about peacemakers. We have to move towards personal conflict, and we have to participate in systems change, systemic conflict and injustice. And how are we participating in bringing about restoration there as well? So thank you. Maybe one more.
I was hesitating, but I'll go ahead, John. I'm Renee Myers, and I work with the Presbyterian Mission Agency, so the wider mission arm of our church, and I'm work with engaging congregations and mid councils around the mission that the wider church is engaged in, and we've been challenged to be a Matthew 25 church, and the mission agency has identified 3 focal areas to focus our work on: eradicating systemic poverty, dismantling structural racism, and nurturing and building congregational vitality, all of which are tied up together. They can't really be separated. And so when I'm having conversations with congregations, and it's specifically around the racism focal area, that that's just such a loaded topic that we don't want to get into the kind of conflict. So I'm hoping to, my message is always, we need to be in respectful conversation with one another before we can ever really get there. But so I'm hoping to learn some new things and be able to engage folks in that kind of work.
Excellent. Thank you. Do you happen to know Bart Tarman, a pastor there, Presbyterian pastor there in Santa Barbara? I see some nods. He's a very close friend and guide to me, so give him a hello if you see him before I do. Excellent. That is really, really helpful. Thanks for making this very practical and very real in each of our lives and in different ways. And I think that'll even help us use this as an opportunity for a collaborative learning, because we're going to probably each be targeting different areas. We heard about 7 different spheres of where this is where we're thinking about landing this, but we can learn from each other in and through that, because no doubt we're all navigating conflict in many different ways in different areas. I want to offer a story, and then I want to offer a brief framework, theological framework, for how to think about peacemaking, and then we're going to go into our practices that you are going to need to work hard to contextualize for your own space. When I was finishing seminary, this story happened 11 years ago. I was in Palestine and Israel, and I was there actually studying the historical context of Jesus, which was fascinating. As a seminarian and a bit of an academic geek, I'm in the Holy Land for a summer with my wife, and she's pregnant with our first baby. And we're going to Jericho, and we're living in Jerusalem, and we're in Bethlehem, and the Dead Sea and Galilee, all over the place. And it was, the text obviously is coming alive in all these new and unique ways. But there was a gentleman that worked at our hotel that we interacted with casually each morning over breakfast. He was serving our food. And each morning we'd have a small but generous conversation. And one day he asked my wife a very brave question: how far along are you? Because she was showing significantly at this point. And she says, I'm 6.5 months along. And And he lights up and says, my wife is also 6 months along. And immediately it went from this relationship that was, consumer to service provider to, wow, we are in a shared season of life that is very significant, transcends any of the borders and boundaries that we've inherited just based on our upbringing and why we're in this room. And our conversations continued. One day he asked if I wanted to spend time with him on the rooftop of the hotel after he got off work just to talk. And of course I said yes. So I get done with the pilgrimage of the day. And I'm up on the rooftop of this hotel in the Christian quarter of the old city of Jerusalem, if you've ever been there. And we're overlooking Herod's palace. And we're talking about everyday stuff. We're talking about being dads. We're talking about the World Cup. And I'll never forget the moment in our conversation when something shifted in him. And I think it was because he was beginning to sense some relational trust, but his cadence began to slow. And he looked at me somberly and he said, John, why do your people think I'm a terrorist? You pray for your meals every morning when 5 minutes away, your sisters and brothers experience daily occupation and oppression. And he said that's when he told me he lives in Bethany in the West Bank. And he says, I follow Jesus just like you do. Jesus is my Messiah. And you can imagine in that moment, my worldview gets blown up, my heart breaks, and I'm standing here with my friend Milad, forced to ask a set of questions I had never had to confront before. At that time, having already been a pastor for about 6 years in seminary, and I had never really been forced to ask the question, what is a theology of peace? And if I have a theology of peace as a follower of Jesus, what does it look like? What's a practice of it? How is it that my brother in Christ on the other side of the world experiences me as a Christian, not as someone who's participating in his healing and liberation, but someone who's participating in his occupation and the injustice of his daily life? It poked holes in everything I had inherited around my understanding of the biblical story, my understanding of the church in its practice and its witness in the world, specifically in places where our influence impacts those on the underside of power. It's because I was inherited a dominant culture, powerful seat in the Western Christian church, especially as a white male. For the rest of the trip, we would finish at 5 p.m. with the Holy Land tour, my wife and I, and we would jump on the local Arab bus, which everyone told us not to get on because that's where the terrorists are, as they would say. And we would cross into through the military checkpoints and into the West Bank to go be with our friend Milad and his wife Manar. The first time we got over there, we get into Bethany, which, by the way, Bethany is the town where Lazarus was raised. So it's a town of historic resurrection. And as we get off the bus and they greet us there and we begin to walk down the main dusty road of Bethany, the kids of the village swarm out of their homes and around the legs of Milad and Manar. And what we found out was the reason that Milad worked at the hotel serving my food and changing my sheets was to raise enough money to lead a nonprofit teaching that reconciliation is possible to the next generation of Palestinian kids. And the rest of our time in that space, we began to get it felt like gospel turned 3D. Oh, this is what good news looks like. This is what God's mission actually looks like. This is what discipleship can look like. And they became very quickly guides and mentors for us in this work. And they continue to be to this day. What it forced me to do was to go back to my seminary studies with a different lens. How do I learn a theology and practice for peace? That's when I launched into my focus being actually in peacemaking in the field of Christian ethics with Dr. Glenn Stassen, who developed the Just Peacemaking theory, which if you're doing some homework, read the book Just Peacemaking. It's a very tangible framework for how to live as peacemakers who are not aloof and withdrawn, nor perpetuating violence. And as I went back to the text, in all the different ways we've heard God's mission defined, things became more clear to me. As I began to examine even the narrative of the text, you have early in the story these Genesis poems in chapters 1 and 2 where God is making all things right. Things are whole. The word is shalom. A peace, a holistic peace is realized. Then we have a conflict in the story in Genesis 3. There's a fracture. And at that point, God doesn't put the pencil down and walk away and say that was a failed project. God makes it God's mission to continue to move towards humanity's broken story and to heal what's been broken, to restore what's been broken. And God enlists the community to participate in that. Sarah and Abraham, go and be good news to the world. Be a reflection of my vision for restoring all that's been broken. You have this community who's struggling to stay faithful to that call. For hundreds of years, they're moving between exile and restoration, first with Assyria, then with Babylon, and they're in exile in Babylon. And it's like there's silence. God, where is God? And the prophets begin to whisper and to weep and to plead and remind the people that God still sees you. God still sees us. God is going to immerse into our conflicted story and contend for our restoration. We see in Jesus the embodiment of God, seeing the humanity, the dignity, the image of God in us, immersing into our story, not in the expected way of a militant to overthrow the powers that be, but as a child, as a suffering servant who contended not through military overthrow, but through suffering and selfless sacrifice, to then plant seeds for resurrection, for restoration, to begin to grow throughout the world. We have this passage that no doubt many of you are familiar with in 2 Corinthians 5, that the Apostle Paul is talking to this community who's trying to figure out how to work together. Jesus is no longer on the scene. They're trying to figure out how to be a community oriented around Jesus with all of their differences. Paul's word to them was, remember that you have been reconciled to God. You have been made right. And now your invitation is to be ministers, to be ambassadors of that reconciliation. And so this journey of understanding, and I'll go back to my screen share here. Let's see. Understanding that God's mission is restoration. All the different definitions I've had of God's mission and papers we've written and all sorts of things. What if God's mission is restoration and that peacemaking is the vocation of God's people? That's our invitation. That's our job. That's what it means to live as ministers or ambassadors of reconciliation. It's to be peacemakers participating in God's holistic work of restoration. Now, going back to my experience with Milad, the question we have to ask is, why haven't we taken this seriously in the church for so long? Why hasn't this been central to how we talk about God's mission and our vocation? And there's all sorts of reasons that we don't have time to get into, but we have theological barriers that have gotten in the way. We have theology, especially in the last 100 years, that have said things like God's mission it can only come true once everything gets worse. Things have to progressively get worse. The Middle East needs to go into fire. It's a theology of dispensationalism that says the only way Jesus is going to return is if things perpetually get worse. Well, where does that leave the work of peacemaking? In that theological framework, the work of peacemaking is actually antithetical to God's mission. Peacemaking would undo what God is supposed to be doing. So we've had theological obstacles, we've had cultural obstacles. We kind of mark peacemaking with the 1960s, and we think of tie-dyed shirts and Volkswagen buses and kind of this euphoric ideal of peace. I think we also have practical, many of us haven't experienced in our churches specifically a robust theology and practice of peace. Conflict arises, our board is trying to figure out how to navigate it. How do we work around the conflict? Or do we just run away from it? Or do we do it really poorly and we just isolate people? It hasn't been something that's been fleshed out. I think it was Sharon who was mentioning your default is to withdraw from conflict. I grew up in a home that saw conflict as like the worst imaginable thing. Conflict or tension arises, tuck it under the rug. Let the resentment grow and fester, and then it'll manifest itself in really unhelpful ways someday, or in therapy. So many of us haven't been given these tools to actually see what peacemaking can look like. So we have theological, we have cultural, we have practical barriers. We would argue that conflict is actually the most dynamic laboratory for genuine relationship. John Paul Lederach would say that conflict is an opportunity. What if instead of seeing conflict as a problem to fix, we see it as an opportunity for transformation? In this way of thinking, conflict then isn't the problem, it's our inability to navigate it well. It's that we don't have tools to get through conflict so we can actually move towards that genuine relationship. It's an important shift in how we think about it, because it moves us from, whoa, I got to tuck that thing away, or I got to go in there and win, to, okay, what is it I have to learn? How am I going to grow, and how is this actually going to grow my relationships? The question we have to ask then as a foundation is, what is peace? We define peace as the holistic repair of relationship. Peace with ourselves, with God, with our neighbor, all of the cosmos, holistic repair of relationship. I love this image of kintsugi, which is a Japanese art where artists build something beautiful, breaks it, then puts it back together. In the places where the fractures or the conflicts or the brokenness once was, it's sealed with seams of gold. And what was once broken is actually more beautiful and stronger than it was before the break. What would it look like if we were to move through conflict and experience restoration? And we don't look back just at the blood and the conflict and the violence. We look and celebrate God's healing. The golden seams is what God has in mind for us. Well, then we have to ask the question, what is peacemaking? Excuse me. Peacemaking is a proactive movement toward conflict with tools to heal and to transform. Peace is not passive. Peace is not about maintaining the status quo. And I think it's important. Even Matt brought up the systemic reality of peacemaking. In this moment, in this political world, it's not about just being passive and allowing the status quo to continue. When we do that, those of us in power remain in power. Those on the underside of power continue to be crushed. Peace is actually about disrupting a pseudo-peace of the status quo. The Roman Empire called that the Pax Romana. Everything was peaceful inside the borders of the Roman Empire, which just meant that those with power could keep it, and those without were without, and anyone that threatened that peace was killed. So peace in peacemaking is a very proactive movement toward and through conflict. It's disrupting any system or structure that maintains a status quo that is not restoration, that is not holistic healing. So the questions we have to ask then are, what are the practices of what we call everyday peacemakers? Again, we're trying to really ground this in every day. What are the practices that allow us to live a theology that says God's mission is restoration, my vocation is to be a peacemaker? Okay, peace is a holistic repair of relationship. Peacemaking is moving toward conflict. What are our tools? What are our practices? So I'm gonna, excuse me, walk through these four. And after each one, I want to open it up for some interaction as you begin to draw some lines of connection to your context, the conflict that's most real to you, as we seek to integrate and apply. All right. My throat is scratchy, so I may be drinking some more water than is normal. The first practice is to see. Everyday peacemakers see the humanity, the dignity, and the image of God in everyone. We have to understand that we have inherently, based on our upbringing, culturally, theologically, politically, our geographic location, we have been taught to see some people and taught not to see others. Based on my upbringing, as a conservative Christian from a military family in the United States, I was taught not to see Milad. He was less than human in that, maybe we wouldn't have used that direct of language, but in every other way, he was taught he was someone I was taught not to see. He was my other. Much of my upbringing probably would have labeled him a terrorist. So we have to ask the formational work. The see practice is really about it's about acknowledgement and confession. Who have I been taught to see, and who have I been taught not to see, based on the cataracts that have grown in my eyes? You know, we talk about race. So many of us in this room are white. What are ways that cataracts have grown in our eyes such that we can't see the humanity, the dignity, the image of God of those that don't look like us? Throughout the scriptures, we obviously see this played out over and over and over again. Jesus saw the humanity, the dignity, the image of God in everyone, whether it's the woman at the well, when he goes off the beaten path and into Samaria, a woman who is considered a second-class citizen in that context, out during the day, had multiple husbands. Jesus sees her, moves towards her, puts his life on the line by actually drinking the water that she, the other, offers him. Just to acknowledge, not to assign her dignity, but just to acknowledge the dignity that already existed within her that maybe she had forgotten. Jesus saw. Jesus saw the tax collectors who were literally in cahoots with the empire, exploiting the people. Jesus invites them towards him in round tables. Jesus saw the humanity, the dignity, the image of God in the very people that were putting him to death when he prays, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." Jesus models to us a kind of seeing that is costly. It's formational. Also an invitation. Throughout the Gospels, we know that Jesus was a sight healer. So what are the ways that Jesus needs to heal our sight today? The cataracts, again, that need to be removed from our eyes. This is the border down here. This is the wall that you hear so much about. And each Sunday, we host a border church where we share Eucharist, just the bread and the wine. It's binational. So half our church is in Tijuana, in Mexico, half our church is in the US. And it's actually a circle known as Friendship Park. We circle up. The only thing that's between us is this physical structure of the wall. And we share our common identity as followers of Jesus who are part of a kingdom that transcends any border or boundary. And through the wall, you have these tiny little holes, and you can only stick a pinky finger in there. They call it a pinky kiss. That's how you greet our friends on either side of the wall. And there's been multiple occasions. One pops out most in my mind of my kiddos. This Sunday, we were worshiping on the northern side. And my friend, who's a Border Patrol agent, who I've built a relationship over the years, was there, and I introduced my kids to him. And he, of course, is generous and welcoming. And then we look through the hole, and there's my friend Yolanda, who's a beautiful woman who was deported 8 years ago and separated from her kids. And my kids are looking through the hole, and they're meeting Yolanda. In this invitation to see the humanity, the image, the dignity, the image of God in the Border Patrol agent and in the deportee, and understand that our allegiance requires us to see the humanity in everyone. It doesn't mean that we agree with all the systems and structures, but on that human level, we can move past our political talking points and into and toward relationship. Jean Vanier says, we create enemies because we haven't confronted the enemy within us. What's the enemy within us? What's the stuff that triggers us? The fears that manifest themselves in finger pointing. The past traumas that lead to wider divides rather than the mending of them. It's a formational, confessional invitation to simply see. And what we found is when we recover our sight and see the way Jesus sees, we will see our other not as a problem to fix, but as a gift to receive. Create space for uncommon friendships to grow. So I want to pause there. I'm going to stop my screen again. And hear from any of you that the question I want to ask is around the first one I posed when I talked about see. Who have we been taught to see and taught not to see? And for you personally, if you're able to in this short amount of time, to ask the question, who have you been taught not to see? And we'll just do like a minute or two, like quick share out, because we actually got to move quickly. Yeah, Susan.
Well, excuse me, I grew up in segregated Maryland, and I was taught not to see the Black community that lived 1 mile north of the white community.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Others? Yeah, Pat, go ahead.
Pat, you're muted.
I grew up in my younger years in Coconut Grove, Florida, and I still say Negro because that's what it is to me. They were my friends. They worked on the estate that my dad was the caretaker of. So I was taught to see Jesus in everybody. And I was in and out of the church that was behind the wall right next to our home, like it was my home. So I feel like I was really blessed to have parents that just taught us to see Jesus in everybody. And it just hurts to see all these homeless people on the streets.
Mm-hmm. I think it's, yeah, Forrest, go ahead, and then Joe and Pat.
In my experience, in some ways, growing up in the 50s, I was taught to not see my own people, other Asian Americans.
Mm.
The overwhelming whiteness, especially in a town like Santa Barbara.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks, Forrest. Joe and Pat, and then we'll keep moving.
I work a lot with chronically homeless individuals, and I think as a community, we are taught to not see persons without homes.
I was just with my kiddos this morning at the park, and Luis is one of our neighbors, and he lived on the streets until a year and a half ago. And we were just reflecting this morning because his past came up, and he said, you know, the most painful thing about living on the streets was that no one actually saw me as human. And that was so striking. It's exactly what you're saying. It wasn't the hunger pangs. It wasn't I was talking about, hey, it's been really cold and rainy. I can't imagine what our friends living on the streets feels like. He said, you know what hurts more is people not actually seeing me as human. And I thought that was really powerful. Okay, for the sake of time, we got to move to our next practice. The next, and I'll share screen again here, is to immerse. Everyday peacemakers immerse by stepping off our roads of comfort and into reality. This is our proactive movement toward conflict. We have seen, once we have seen compassion grows, there is responsibility. We move towards the pain, the injustice, the conflict, the difference. Jesus obviously models this in moving towards us in incarnation. Jesus then spends 30 years simply being a product, a boy of the Galilee. It's only his last 3 years, 10% of his life, that he's doing active ministry. He immersed and then was there. He was present. He lingered. I think oftentimes we see and have been taught that if we move towards conflict, or we move towards people who look or think or believe or act differently than we do, somehow it'll compromise our faith. We would say, no, that doesn't compromise our faith. It actually reflects a fragile faith. To move towards our other is a reflection of a strong faith, of our deep convictions. To move towards disagreement. Imagine if we could go into a space where we didn't all have to agree with each other to be in relationship with each other. Oftentimes our need for agreement is a prerequisite for relationship, and we don't get to actually move towards and be in relationship with people who look and think and believe differently than we do. So how do we do this? How do we actually immerse? A couple tangibles I would say is to practice listening longer than feels comfortable. When you're sitting with someone who disagrees with you or who you don't think the same way, what would it look like to listen longer than feels comfortable rather than just react and continue volleying off each other's triggers? When we get triggered, we just volley off each other's triggers back and forth. Listen longer than feels comfortable. St. Francis would say, we need to seek to understand rather than to be understood. How do we move into those hard conversations, seeking to understand our other, whether that's a close family member or someone on the other side of the political aisle, rather than to get our agenda across? For us, it was important. It was the day after the election this year. One of our neighbors came up to our house, and we'd actually seen him at the park a few days earlier, and he asked my kiddos, what's something you love? Like, what's a animal or an image you love? And they shared, and it was cute, but we didn't know what he was asking for. Well, this day he comes up, and he had done artwork on stones reflecting each of their four images of what they love. It was beautiful. And he had a sticker on his shirt of the candidate we did not vote for. And my kiddos saw that immediately. In one hand, they're receiving this beautiful gift of someone who has seen them and is present to them and is thoughtful and caring, and someone who thinks politically different than them. And it was such a gift of proximity in the context of immersion, of being present with one another, for them to see just because someone voted differently doesn't mean that they're any less human. Doesn't mean we agree with them. And there's lots of reasons why we don't agree with them, because it impacts our other neighbors. But it doesn't mean that we can dehumanize. Dehumanization, it dehumanizes both the person being dehumanized and those of us that use the language. It makes us less human. Immersion, being present and proximate, moving toward and through conflict, gives us the gift of that nuance. It allows us to see the humanity and the dignity and the image of God in our others. So the question I want you to ask, and we're not going to have time to reflect here, is what's one tangible way you can begin to immerse toward that conflict in your life? And that might be a person. It might be as tangible as I'm going to, on Tuesday at 9 o'clock, pick up the phone to call this person to set up a time to have a Zoom coffee with them. It might be talking about proximity. It might be diversifying our news sources, so we're not just hearing through one lens. We can actually immerse and grow proximate by widening our aperture of our worldview. We can get really practical. What might that look like? I'm going to move to the next practice for the sake of time here. Everyday peacemakers stand in front of any bulldozer that's flattening people. We contend not by getting even, but getting creative in love. This is the justice piece of our everyday peacemaking arc. Peacemaking is not passive, it's proactive, it disrupts. What is the stuff that's flattening people, especially those on the underside of power, that we have the opportunity to stand in front of? We're called to roll up our sleeves. Now, what's unique about being followers of Jesus, this contending, this justice piece, doesn't look like, again, weapons and swords. It looks like suffering and self-sacrifice. It's courageous. It's costly. It's Matthew 5 when Jesus says to walk the extra mile, to turn the other cheek, to give everything away. It requires us getting creative in love. It requires us listening to the Spirit to guide us in and through these challenging moments with an alternative to violence that's not passive. After the Tree of Life synagogue massacre, maybe some of you remember when 11 folks from that congregation were killed. I'm part of an interfaith clergy network here in San Diego. The local rabbi called a vigil and said, hey, and she reached out to a bunch of us, Christians, Muslims, Sikh, fellow Jews, to come together to hold vigil. And we showed up to the point where her synagogue was overflowing. The fire codes wouldn't allow anyone else to get in. And they closed the gate on us. I got there just after they'd closed the gate. And when I go to these things, I usually wear my clergy collar. And as we're all standing out there, and now there's hundreds of people on the sidewalk, one of the Jewish women from the congregation said, this is a moment I need to be with my community. I need to lament. Would you be someone who could host a vigil here? And so I interacted with a couple of the people from the congregation to say, hey, is this even appropriate? Would this be helpful? There was another Jewish leader there, and we facilitated this sidewalk vigil. We read the names of those who were lost. We read prayers of lament from the Hebrew scriptures. We stood in the pain and solidarity with those experiencing this violation. Contending in that moment looked like simply being present, showing up, walking out of our doors and onto our streets to be with those who were in pain. How do we contend in this moment when so many of our sisters and brothers on the underside of power are impacted by these broken systems? You know, just because someone's elected doesn't mean everything's going to change overnight. How are we contending not just for that personal relationship that's broken, but contending for the big picture stuff around systemic injustice, around race, around immigration, and leveraging what's ours on behalf of those impacted? So again, I'm not prescribing these things to you. You have to do the work to contextualize them. What is it you're being called into as an everyday peacemaker? How are you seeing? How are you immersing? What's a contend practice? Once you've seen and immersed, now how do you contend? Instinct oftentimes of white privileged Christians is to skip right to the contend. We want to fix everyone else's problems. And we can often just perpetuate a form of colonialism that has done damage for centuries. So it's so important that we do the work of seeing and immersing before we go into the diagnosis mode to contend in ways that may be more harmful than helpful. Finally, oh, I think I had a picture. This is the picture of that sidewalk vigil that I just shared about. Everyday peacemakers share tables with former enemies and celebrate the big and small ways God is restoring our broken world. This last practice is less a practice and more a celebration of what God is doing. We aren't the ones to restore, God is. But when we see and immerse and contend, we can participate in that restoration. We can see these mustard seeds of restoration sprouting all around us, and we can do our very best to celebrate them when they happen. In your communities, knowing that many of you probably represent different congregations, how are you celebrating? How are you making it a practice to celebrate when restoration happens? Because we don't always know if it's going to happen. We're still going to have friends that go back into addiction. We're still going to have marriages that fails. We're still going to have broken systems continue to break our neighbors. When we see restoration, how are we making it a practice to identify it, to celebrate it? That is the fuel for our practice as everyday peacemakers. I love the way Jesus, post-resurrection Jesus, had a fractured relationship with Peter. If you remember, Peter denied him before his crucifixion 3 times. Jesus is resurrected, comes back to the Galilee, knows there's a relationship that's still broken. What does he do? He sets a table on the shores of the Galilee in John 21, invites Peter to that table. And he says, Peter, do you love me? And Peter says, yes. Do you love me? Yes. Do you love me a 3rd time? Yes. Jesus was restoring what had been broken earlier in the story. And we often say that the table is the most important piece of furniture in the kingdom of God. Who is around our table? Whether it's a physical table, a virtual table, organizational table. Who is around our table? That's a reflection of the ways that we're participating with God in healing what's broken. So I want to go back to this image of kintsugi, of us understanding that when we move toward and through conflict, we have the opportunity not to just maintain a status quo, but to disrupt it, to participate in God's restoration. When we live as peacemakers, we get to join God in mending the divides of what's broken and celebrate the ways that God is healing our broken world. These seams of gold are a reflection of God's best work in ways that we get to participate in it. So for us, and I know our time is coming to a close, some tangible ways that maybe we can support you in you personally, maybe you and your congregation. As a peacemaking training organization, our work is to work this stuff out together and to help make this real in your own context. So there's 2 ways I want to invite you to consider engaging with us. One, let me stop our share screen so I can drop this in the chat thread. Oh, there we go. Is to text the word peace to 66866. This automatically sends you 30 days of practices. C for week 1, immerse, contend, restore for weeks 2, 3, and 4. Great tool to do personally or with your community. And then a series of other practices that come after that. That'll just get sent right to your inbox. The second way is to go to info@globalimmerse.org, to send an email there. We do personal coaching and consulting for communities, for leaders, ways that we can help you move through these, especially these polarized times. We also have a workshop right now that we're facilitating called Having Hard and Healing Conversations. As we feel like one of the ways to de-escalate this polarized moment is actually to have tools to have hard conversations. So you can send email there. Our website has a large archive of free webinars. Last year, we focused a lot of our energy around race, peacemaking and race, and politics. So there's some great scholars and practitioners that we profiled. You get access to those and watch them whenever you would like, or use them with your community. Let me offer this prayer, this benediction, as I know we're going into break here in a moment. And I'm going to go back to my share screen because I have this written out for us. Oh, there's a picture of what you would get if you text that number. So friends, may we see conflict not as a problem to fix, but as an opportunity for transformation. May we welcome the strangers among us and embrace them as neighbors. May we reject the paralysis of fear and be moved by our mandate to love. May we listen longer than feels comfortable and seek to understand rather than to be understood. May we be known by our invitation rather than our isolation. May we lean into deep relationships that transcend our borders and boundaries. And may we live as instruments of peace in Santa Barbara or wherever you're from and into our world. It's been a gift to be with you all. Much love. Thanks for being here.
Thank you so much, John. And we'll see the rest of you in the sanctuary in about 5 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you. See ya.
Thank you, John.
You bet.
Thank you. That was
John,
really
so
helpful.
much.
Thank you, John.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, John. We chose well when we signed you up.
Mm,
Good to
Good
see your face,
job,
Chuck.
Chuck.
it was a good one.
We did